hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome back to episode 8 of season 3's Hidden in Plain Sight, the web and podcast that dares to ask, what if Christopher Marlowe did not die in Deptford in 1593? I'm Dr. Julian Ng, your host for the series. In this episode, we continue our discussion with Dr. Joseph Khoury, Professor and Chair of St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Joining him is our resident expert, Dr. Peter Hodges, the author of Marlowe's Complaint. Together, they will take another look at the rival poet sonnets, the sequence of sonnets, numbers 78 to 86, in the collection known as Shakespeare's Sonnets. In our last episode, Peter introduced his methodology for examining a series of statements that he's assembled from those sonnets, which he hopes will lead to him unmasking the identity of the rival poet. How exciting! Dr. Khoury, meanwhile, is examining him step by step and making sure that he considers all the different factors, including what might be flaws in the methodology. I think you'll agree with me that so far it's been a pretty lively conversation, with nothing taken for granted. Now, however, Peter proposes to dig deeper into the sonnets with several additional statements, or eyewitness testimonies as he calls them. Let's see how he does with the reasonable skepticism of Dr. Khoury.
So we left off at the end of the last episode, so to speak, and we'd walked our way through 3 descriptive portions of the rival poet sonnet sequence that allowed us to narrow down the number of candidates to about a half a dozen, more or less. And without naming them all, I mean, I think you probably you could assume George Chapman is in there because we talked about it. I can't think of all the other names, but let's say Lady Pembroke is still in there. And maybe Ben Jonson we're going to allow to still hang around, on the strength of he wrote so much crazy stuff, you can almost be certain that he did something nautical and he did something. But now we come to, I think, what is the real central issue, and the sort of, this is the one that makes it impossible for almost anyone other than Chapman to be our rival. And this is the very beginning of the rival poet sequence. And I've got the book, and so I'll read it to you. How's that? So oft have I invoked thee for my muse, and found such fair assistance in my verse, as every alien pen hath got my use, and under thee their poesy disperse. So, what could he possibly mean by that? What could this anonymous author be referring to when he says, every alien pen hath got my use? And, the first thing that you might think is that he's accusing someone of plagiarism. Right? Every alien has got my use. So he's saying they're stealing my stuff. Except that the following line says, under thee their poetry disperse. So he's not talking about his poetry being stolen. He's talking about their poetry being dispersed by an alien pen. Well, why would he care about that unless that alien pen is making use of him somehow? And what does that mean? What does that mean? And I mean, I'm open to your observations on that. I can tell you what I think it means.
Sure. I mean, these, of course, could also be quite metaphorical, right? I mean,
Yeah, they can be, but they could also,
You
but where you find a literal application, would you prefer that more than you would a metaphor?
Well, I don't know that, I mean, as I said last time, I think part of the problem is, you know, you're beginning with the supposition that the name attached to the poems is not the author.
I didn't begin with that supposition. I'm not making any supposition about that.
Okay, well, fine.
I'm
That's
not,
fine. But
I'm saying that anybody who presupposes that Shakespeare is the author is making a supposition that is not based on anything in the text of the actual poem. His name does not appear in the poem, and he didn't sign the poem. The poems were published under his name. That is true.
yeah, well,
There's
you know,
there's a lot of dispute about whether or not they were authorized, right?
well, I mean, the dispute comes mainly from people who don't want to associate Shakespeare with the poems.
Oh, I don't think that's true. I think the dispute started before that. Sidney Lee was the one who said, Thorpe just gathered them up helter-skelter and just published them. And he accused Thorpe of being a pirate.
But
And
again, that's supposition, right? I mean, like in other
well,
words,
it is, of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what I said last time is, to be able to publish things in those days with a master of revels, I mean, they controlled, to what extent is maybe debatable, how much control did they have, maybe debatable, but there was certainly fear from, being brought to face the master of revels. So, to put to put your names to a poem or a play was not something that, anybody would just want to do. Um, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, I certainly have no problem in people, speculating, but my point is that one must also take into account the fact that and so's name is attached to a work from the time.
Well, if we look at other contemporaneous pieces where somebody's name is attached to it in one fashion or another, and actually I was doing a little work on this section and I came across another example of this. I mean, there's the famous example of the Passionate Pilgrim,
Right,
where you have Shakespeare's name on top of 12 poems, only 5 of which in the volume are really attributable to the man we call Shakespeare.
right,
Because we know that 2 of the poems are out of Love's Labour's Lost, and 2 others are variations on Venus and Adonis, and no, 2 others are poems that actually later appear in the sonnets themselves, and one of them is a variation on Venus.
right,
But then that leaves 7 others that have been fairly well attributed to a handful of other poets that were not
right,
Shakespeare. So one of those poets may complain that Shakespeare could complain that his name is being used to sell another man's poems,
right,
conceivably, except that it's Jagard who published that. And there's no patron or dedicated person in that. So we have it kind of doesn't quite fit the descriptions that we've pulled out of the sonnets, but it's
right,
there. It's definitely there. And then you have Lady Pembroke, who published, her Arcadia, which was Philip Sidney's Arcadia, edited by Lady Pembroke. But she was careful to say, this is my brother's original work
right.
that I've updated. And I came across another one where Tom Watson, you may remember this one,
Mm.
he published a poem called Amintas in Latin,
Mm-hmm.
and Abraham France rather, he translated it and published it in English. And he didn't give any credit to
Right,
Watson. And Watson subsequently complained about it in his dedication to the poem that he wrote for Sir Francis Walsingham upon his death, Meliboeus.
Right.
So we have these examples of this kind of thing going on, but I'm only saying that with regard to the sonnets, that the nature of the sonnets and how they came to be early on, when people started analyzing them, when the critics first began to think about what they were, early on, they considered it to be a pirated job. And with regard to the Master of Revels, by the way, I don't think they had anything to do with publishing poetry. I think that was the stationers. And I don't know that there's any outright censorship or preceding, authority over publication of poetry. That's
Yeah,
a
I mean,
question.
as I said, I mean, I know one could dispute how much influence or authority they had in fact versus just in theory, but I'm guessing that because there was such an office in place, there would have been a sense of one has to be careful. Now I may be wrong in this. I don't
Well,
know.
yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think
And I don't know if I'm right. I'm
but
saying
you're
that,
living in a society that is managed, and
yeah, well, and with real fear, right? I mean, so
yeah,
again,
people published Catholic stuff all the time. They published, where you have a really good example of what you're talking about is the Mar Prelate thing.
yeah. Well, and Elizabeth's spy network was very effective. I mean, you look at, John Stubbs' hand being cut off for publishing his pamphlet,
Right,
So,
right.
So my point is that I would wonder, if someone was going to publish something, I mean, would you put a different name, one who hadn't written the work? I don't know. I just, think it's a real question to be contemplated,
Well,
Now,
we have examples of we certainly have examples of the London Prodigal and
yeah,
Locrine and other plays which were published with Shakespeare's name on them, and we know he didn't write them.
yeah,
And without having any other, authority than the historians who studied the matter, the assertion has been made that this was a name that sold plays.
right,
And for all you know, in some cases, these could have been plays that appeared at his theater, the Globe,
right,
or prior to that, or later on,
right,
Blackfriars.
sure,
So to the degree that he was at the same time a producer, and it appeared at his playhouse, if he was that big a name, then it would be Walt Disney's bank, and you wouldn't care
right,
who the real writer was,
right,
right? It's Walt Disney is the
right,
draw. And who wrote Bambi? Well, it wasn't Walt Disney. I can tell
yeah,
you that much. I don't know who wrote Snow White either, but it wasn't
yeah,
Walt Disney. So in this instance, I don't. I'm not trying to dispute at this moment whether or
right,
not Shakespeare is the actual author of all 154 sonnets.
right,
That's really not the question that I'm asking here. The only thing I'm looking to is who is the rival poet.
okay,
Okay, and so I am only just looking at that
okay,
text as a statement to describe who the rival poet is,
okay,
separate and apart from the question of who maybe wrote this.
right,
We may get to, but first and foremost,
okay,
right?
okay,
Okay, so now we're looking at the statement about every alien pen hath got my use, and I
right,
think it's fair. And again, I'm going to say I don't know if there are others examples of any of this out there. I don't know if there's another. I've looked high and low, but there may be something there could be things I don't know. It's just possible. But where this description can fit a specific instance, I think we have to take note of that instance.
okay,
and we have to allow ourselves to observe that as a set of descriptions, there's this one guy who's matched all three of the first three descriptions.
Right.
There's a couple of other people that we've brought along somewhat, graciously, to allow ourselves the opportunity not to have to commit too early. Or maybe we've made a mistake somewhere. So we're including Johnson and Lady Pembroke and Samuel Daniel maybe in the boat. But now we turn to this, where an author is literally saying somebody's making use of me to publish his poems. And what use do you make of a man if you're not using his poems?
Right.
What do you use? What is it? What could it be? And I think, pretty soon you get to the point where you think about, well, his name.
Right.
Is what he's complaining about, his name, because, and you don't have to go very far to have somebody quote Hamlet to you. What's money? Here, there, it's someone else's, but my name, my name. And so is there a person who, in our group of candidates, who published his poetry using another man's name to help him sell it? And lo and behold, George Chapman did exactly that. He published Hero and Leander, but when he published it, and today it is still the one that when you go and order it from Amazon or anywhere, you're going to end up with Hero and Leander, begun by Christopher Marlowe and completed by George Chapman.
Right.
That's the version that's most widely available. And that's the version that George Chapman published in 1598, which, by the way, was the same year that Blount published Marlowe's version solo.
Right.
So there it is. That is like, that's the category. And Chapman happens to have a pretty ripe example that matches that description. Unless there's another, there could be another way that you could use a man to disperse your poetry, but you wouldn't complain if he was a publisher.
Right.
Right? Because at that point, what is he, your agent? You didn't have people like that. So, and the person who's complaining, it wouldn't be an agent, or a publisher wouldn't complain unless the publisher's name was being misused and the publisher was saying, you put my name on that and called me the publisher, but I'm not the publisher. But other than that, I think you're down to one writer complaining about another writer making use of the first writer's name. I give you that as there's an example of what that could mean. And if anybody, in a subsequent episode, after you have time to think about this, and you study the matter, and somebody mentions something to you and you come back with it, I want to know. Because I have looked and I can't find another instance, especially in that period. I just want, it's like a ghostwriter complaining about somebody, except that, no, he's using my words and putting his name on top of it. It's a different thing. It's like somebody saying, but the only thing that matters is my name. Right? And then you put your poems under it. It's the Hero and Leander and George Chapman and Christopher Marlowe, and that is the thing that matches. And that's the first thing he complains about in line 3 of the first 3 lines of the entire Rival Poet sequence. The first thing he says is that every alien pen hath got my use. And then what does he say? He says, and it's your fault. He says, it's your fault, Mr. Patron. It's your fault. You're doing this to me. That's what he turns around and says. He says, it's you doing this. And here is when I think you really get into something very interesting, because that fourth line where it says under thee his poetry disperse,
Right.
if you go and you look either at the original publication, well, actually, let me stop you here. Let me stop myself here. The first publication of Hero and Leander is the only one, the first George Chapman version is the only one that includes the dedication to Audrey Walsingham.
Right.
And where is that dedication? Where does it appear in the text? When you're looking at the published text, or when you get it online, when you look it up online, when the one that you're going to buy, because strangely enough, subsequent texts, subsequent publications, the 1603 version omitted the dedication to Audrey, took it out. So that dates when this is happening. That dates this to 1598, to that particular time. And what happens is it reproduces the entire text of the original Marlowe standalone poem. So you get the title, you get Blunt's dedication, which tells us that Marlowe is dead, and it tells us that Walsingham was his patron. And then you get Marlowe's 782 lines of Hero and Leander.
Right.
Then you get the dedication to Audrey. And after that, you get Chapman's additions. So when the sonnet says, under thee, his poetry disperse, that literally matches that. That literally turn the page, dedication to Audrey, turn the page, under Audrey, Chapman's appear.
So what's it say exactly?
Which the sonnet?
Dedication.
Oh, the dedication has a lot going on in it. One of the things that you want me to read the whole dedication to you?
No, but just, what you say, it literally matches it. So what exactly does it say?
Well, he goes and he starts off with, to my Lady Audrey Walsingham, mistress of the bedchamber, lady of the bedchamber to Queen Elizabeth. So
Right.
this is like the first published acknowledgement of Audrey Walsingham being elevated to this position.
Right.
He goes in to explain that he was moved by some strange inspiration to dabble with this trifle, as he calls it. He's really he's so Chapman, to me, he just wears me out anyway. But he's very tiresome, man, and at the same time he's so full of himself, and if he didn't have friends, but at any rate, then he goes on to say that all poets, we do this all for money, but I'm not doing that for you. I'm doing it because I admire you so much. It's like foot in your mouth. This
He's a flatterer, sure.
He's really just lathering it on. And then he carries on, and then he actually goes to making a comment about, he says, this jointure of my completion with Marlowe's original is a mirror of your reunion with your husband.
Right.
He's actually, with a remark like that, he's actually seems to be saying that there was some sort of I don't know, renuptialization. I mean, it's a
Hmm.
5-year anniversary possibly of their marriage. And
Right.
this is a celebration of that. And so he's patting himself on the back at how clever he is to marry his poem to Marlowe's the same way your union has been rejoined. It's really quite a remarkable set of statements, and
Mm.
and I think really over the top. It just,
Right.
it doesn't, you don't have to do all that. You
Mm.
should just said, I'm doing this because you're such a great person, and thank you so much, and I hope you like it. And he could have left it there, but he just can't stop himself. And then, you get into the poem, and it really knifes Marlowe in the back. I mean, the whole issue of premarital sex is dredged up again, and the only thing he can focus on is the aftermath, of the reason why we get married is so that the girls don't have to suffer after these boys have their way with them. Well, what are you
Well,
really
you
saying
know,
there?
I mean, I'm of the view that, and it's been a long time since I've read the full Venus and Adonis, sorry, Hero and Leander.
Right.
But I'm of the view that his so-called continuation is just a way of using Marlowe's name to perk up his own reputation as a poet. I don't believe it's a continuation. I think it's a separate poem. I mean, are they tied thematic? Sure, of course, but I certainly don't believe that he did a better job than Marlowe, or
No,
B that it's a continuation per se. I don't believe that. Now, I mean, when I've taught Marlowe and I've taught, Hero and Leander, I've only taught Marlowe's Hero and Leander. Now, but again, that's been some years now, so my memory is not fresh. But you know, I'm agreeing with you in that, by acknowledging what I think is certainly a reality even today. People will use other artists to build up their own reputation,
right,
to to
right.
to to move their reputation up. It's a political game in some ways. And in those days, it would have meant literal wealth, because patrons will, of course, you know, they want to patronize better artists, better poets. So that's one way to perk up your reputation. It's not something that I've studied in any detail, God knows, but it's just my own view of how these things I think happened. And I'm happy to be corrected on that, but that's my perception of how things happen at any rate. It's not an area that I've delved into too deeply. I just know that human beings, we inevitably are users. you know it's just and certainly in those days, poets needed patrons, especially if theaters were shut down regularly due to the plague, for example. So you know I think that, I mean, Marlowe was such a marvelous poet, that you know Venus and Adonis, of course, is in talks with Hero and Leander.
Well, that's a whole nother can of worms,
Well,
which,
fair enough, but my point is, I do think that Chapman would have been using Marlowe for sure. I mean, Marlowe was highly regarded, so no question about it.
right. Okay. Now we are at the end of the 5 things that I've pulled out,
Hmm.
the rival poet sequence that identifies what I consider are specific statements that identify this particular individual, not by drawing a picture of him, but by
Right.
telling us who his friends were and what he did.
Okay.
And I was thinking about this the other day. 5 statements. If you're looking for a fingerprint, 5 curls on a fingerprint, that's not really enough. That's not going
Mm.
to be enough for any fingerprint expert to be able to say that's definitive. even
Okay.
though we've eliminated now, I think, when you're looking at the world of fingerprints and you're looking at the world of who can be a suspect and so forth, you you have a world of individuals, and the fingerprint has to take into account that there are so many other people that you haven't even identified as suspects.
Okay.
But when we're looking in this particular arena, there are only so many people who are even eligible to be suspects. There's no Russian poet that we can include. There's no French poet that we can include who came over the channel and possibly, there's nothing like that, right?
Right.
So and somebody once said to me, well, it could be somebody we just don't know of. And I said, well, he wouldn't be a very good poet if you didn't know of him.
Mm.
He obviously, and what kind of rival would he be if nobody knew who the heck he was and he never published anything? And yet you want to tell me he's sufficient to be a rival for who you think was Shakespeare?
Right.
That's a kind of argument that you can't argue against, except to say you don't have any reason to believe that other than that you just don't want to talk about this anymore.
Mhm.
Which is fine. Okay, we won't talk about it anymore, but you're a captive audience, so you can't get away. But I agree, five things is only, it's only the beginning. It only isolates us down to, it looks like Chapman is the person we should really focus on. And is there anything else in these sonnets that will help us understand whether or not Chapman can really be the rival?
Right.
Okay, and I think if we then say, all right, we're going to, since these are poets, and since the rival poet is not a rival because he's better with horses. And he's not a rival because he's got a bigger house. He's not
Mm.
a rival because he's got a more presentable garden. He's a
Mm.
rival because he's a poet, and we're both
Right.
poets, and so therefore it's got to be he's a rival because he's a better poet, or you are
Right.
patronizing him because he's a poet. So then the question becomes, is there a poem that demonstrates this? Is there a reason why? And if we look at Chapman and what he was writing and when he wrote them and you know what would be something that would cause another writer to complain about, would that writer make reference to that man's work? And if he did, would it tell us what that work is?
Okay.
Because if we knew what the work was, we might know why he was angry at him in the first place. Now, we've already identified Hero and Leander as being at least one of the poems that Chapman wrote. We have 4 or 5 others that we know he wrote, but we have Hero and Leander as being something that carries another writer's name on it
Right.
that's being used to sell Hero and Leander.
Right.
So the suspicion is that that's what we're complaining about. And should we then go and look and see what else this series tells us and to help us identify that poem? And so we've still got plenty of time. We got about 10 minutes here. Would you say
Yeah.
we got
Yeah.
about 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a statement that's made at the end of the sequence, and a lot of people have tried to use that statement as a kind of identifier and a describer of the poet, of the rival. And I think this is a mistake. I think it misleads you because it is the reference to a better spirit uses your name.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think that part of it is actually also in 78. No. In 86, was it his spirit by spirits taught to write above a mortal pitch that struck me dead? No, neither he nor his compeers by night, giving him aid, my verse astonished. So that's in 86. That's lines 5 through 8.
Yeah.
So this attention given to spirits is something that various critics have assumed is a description of the rival. In other words, the rival must have had an interest in the occult.
Right.
Because he's talking to the dead. And, spirits at night teaching him to write. And then was it that struck me dead? So there's this whole focus on this idea that he's communicating with the other world. And so
Right.
they look for writers who appear to have occult leanings, and Barnaby Barnes, I guess, is one of them. And Spencer is also one of those writers who, of course, Fairy Queen. I don't think Fairy Queen is altogether about the occult, but being that we don't have fairies in the real world, I guess you would say yes, they're spirit beings. And so some of the critics have identified those lines as making reference to that type of poetry, and that Spencer is a candidate thereby. And that's all well and good to me. That's fine. That's just fine. Because sure, why not? I don't think that that's actually a description of the poet as much as it is a description of the poem. And the reason I think that is because in Chapman's version of Hero and Leander, he goes into that whole strange inspiration and strange instigation that caused him to write it. And he seems to suggest that it was the dead Marlowe speaking to him, right? That caused him, that inspired him. And he has a long passage where he talks about the Empyrean fires, and he climbs to the top of this blazing spiritual heat that then causes him to find Musaeus, another dead poet, and then putting all that together, he explodes forth with this poem, which he dedicates to Audrey.
Right.
So, in other words, while one could say that the spirit and the discussion of the spirit, which is a very popular theme, I think, in Elizabethan England poetry, indicates that that could be a poet, it also indicates what poem it could be.
Right.
And that then is satisfied not because George Chapman is particularly fascinated by the occult, but because his poem, Hero and Leander, makes a huge point of talking about spiritual inspiration as being his motivation for the poem.
Right.
Are you with me?
I'm with you.
Do you disagree with any of that?
No, I don't disagree. I mean, I think it is certainly in Sonnet 86, it is a possibility that it's Chapman. It's also a possibility that it's Marlowe, I mean, as the rival poet. I don't think anyone has come to a certain, I don't think anything is conclusive, but certainly those names have been proposed in the past, and I think they're still worthwhile proposing. I mean, is it Chapman who's referenced in 86? Now, one thing that I think one should possibly contemplate is it possible that there are two rival poets being proposed in these sonnets? 86 would be one, and then 78 to 80 would be another. I don't know. Is it one poet? I don't know. It could be only Chapman. It could be only Marlowe. It could be both. It could be, neither. It could be just a supposed, a metaphorical poet. I don't know. But the idea that other poets are being referenced is not certainly, I think it's a realistic, assumption. Is it Chapman? Yeah, it could be. I think it could be Chapman. Is it Marlowe? That it could be too. Shakespeare does reference Marlowe in
As You Like It.
but also I think in the Windsor play, I think as well, makes a reference to him, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to refresh my memory. In Merry Wives of Windsor, right? I think he also references him there. I can't remember now. And I should know, but I've been so far away from that world now. So my point is, it's not unheard of, and I think it's great to be able, if one could show conclusively that this is so and so. Yeah, it's a
Well, I think the process that I'm trying to impose on this is one that tries to remove some of these doubts.
Yeah.
Because I think you start with the doubts, but as you proceed, you have to keep in mind that we have established certain things.
Mm-hmm.
We have established that of all the people we've been talking about, Chapman is the number one person who matches all of the things so far discussed.
Right.
We're looking at 6 separate identifying statements, eyewitness statements by somebody trying to tell you who this person is.
Yeah.
And I'm saying he's trying to tell you because if he wasn't trying to tell you, he wouldn't bother at all.
Right.
He's making a great point and a great effort putting into these 9 sonnets all the detail that he can reasonably put in without actually writing the man's name.
Right.
And he's telling you his life story,
Yeah.
I mean, he's giving you indicators of a variety of poems that he's making reference to. And let's make the further point that he's actually putting this into a period of time, because when you look at the poems that we know that appear to be referenced, that satisfy the description, that gives us the reasons why we think it's Chapman.
Right.
When we talk about the hymns, that's a poem that was published in 1594. When we talk about the nautical stuff, that's talking about the poem that he wrote about Sir Francis Drake, and a poem that translation of the Iliad, which was 1598. We're not talking about anything after that. And Chapman, as a specific individual, wrote a lot of stuff after that.
Yeah, he did, absolutely.
Right? But none of that is referenced.
Right.
None of that is referenced. The only thing that are referenced are these specific things, and they all happened 1598 or before.
Right.
So that's important to note.
Yeah, I think it is, absolutely. And certainly, what it can give us.
But when you're working your way through this process, we've pushed away a lot of other people to pull them back in, even to pull Spencer back in. You have to say, well, yeah, Spencer definitely matches something, having to do with spirits, but he doesn't match nautical and he doesn't match hymns. And so what are you supposed to do with that? Chapman still beats him 6-2. That's a win in anybody's game.
Right.
6-2 is I win. You only got 2 buckets out of, I got 6. Done. This horse.
It's an interesting exercise for sure.
But we're not done. We're not done.
No, I know.
We're done today.
Yeah, I know. And it is, interesting enough, it's an argument, there is no direct evidence. It is about, trying to read between the lines, right?
Well, then I'm trying not to do that. I'm sincerely now. I'm trying not to read between the lines or interpret anything.
Yeah.
I'm trying to take these statements as literally true.
Mhm.
because everything falls apart if I try to make it a relativistic exercise.
Right.
I'm saying it is literally true that George Chapman wrote something that it would include the image of full proud sails.
Okay.
I'm saying it's literally true that I can pull up a volume of poems that has hymns in it written by George
Right.
Chapman. That's literally true. It
Yeah,
is
yeah, no, that's good.
literally true that George Chapman did not have exclusive rights to any given patron, whereas other people did. That's
Right.
literally a fact. And it's literally a fact that George Chapman published his poem under
Right.
Patrick Walsingham's name and under Christopher Marlowe's name. He did
Yeah.
that. He did do that. And this is not a metaphor. Now, if you want to look for metaphors and you want to bring in the metaphors, that's okay.
Yeah.
You know, you can use metaphors to wedge certain people in, just like we're stretching the definition
Well,
in.
and having hard evidence is better than a metaphor. There's no question
Well,
about it.
you would agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, okay then, because not everybody would, but but having these are statements made that some people may interpret as metaphorical, but they also happen to correspond to factual reality.
Right.
That there's actual published documents that they correspond to, and we're not cheating.
Yeah.
We're not, smearing the lines a little bit so that we can no, it's a real thing that we're talking about. And so when we say spirits, well, Chapman used that word. He used it over and
Right.
over and over in his
Right.
in his version of Hero and Leander, which is not a poem about spirits at all. But